device, I should say, that we used to shoot this was something similar to the Interatron that Errol Morris uses. So people were able to look directly into I think it's called a sight line. I believe that's what the device is called. Maybe I'm wrong. But what happens is that my eyes would appear over the lens of the camera. And it's weird, too, because it looks like your eyes are sort of shifted over from your face, right? Just one slice of your face is like to the left or to the right. And so people, they feel like they're making eye contact with you, and so it's a much more intimate connection. But yeah, no, I definitely do.
Is that a widely available technology? I've not actually seen that in practice a lot.
Yeah, I don't think a lot of people know about it, but yes, it is a device that you can buy for, I think, $1,000.
That's actually not bad.
Oh, no, it's fantastic. It's extremely easy to use. You unfold it from the case, you put it on your tripod, you put the camera on top of that, you are good to go. It uses mirrors.
Right up until March 2020. I think I probably did my last interview in March 2020 in person. And then obviously we were forced to do all these virtually. I used to refuse to do things over Zoom because it was so important for me to sit down and be in front of somebody. Obviously, given my resources and everything else, it's a lot easier to do it this way. But it wasn't. And I think a lot of this is because we were forced to do this throughout the pandemic, but it wasn't as difficult of a shift as I thought it might have been initially.
Yeah, I find it seems like a perfectly natural thing to do, and did seem that way from the beginning. So, but I mean, I appreciate what you're saying also. There's a level of you have a certain intimacy that you don't have in person in a strange way, because we're both looking at each other through this device and it's mediated and we have headphones on. So we're really concentrating on what we're saying.
To actually sort of travel around, you did this in 3 cities and to go meet people, you must have the sense that there's something that you can perhaps get out of somebody conversationally that you wouldn't be able to otherwise.
Getting from them in person.
In person.
Oh yeah, of course. I mean, especially with occult stuff, you have to, I'm asking people to express on camera some, for the most part, probably privately held belief, something that they're not necessarily talking about with their coworkers or their neighbors or even many of their friends, really. And so that level of trust has to be established, and I think that's easier to do in person than when you sort of crash land into a Zoom call.
I imagine that every person that you spoke to for this project is putting that information out there in some way, right? And they have some sort of, whether it's internet presence or they're writing books. What is that disconnect where somebody feels like, in some sense they can be sort of very public about this information and probably reach more people than you would day to day, but that you can't really have that kind of conversation with the person next door?
Well, I think these people have the courage of their convictions. So it doesn't. I think it doesn't feel as controversial to them as it might seem to other people. But it's actually, you'd be surprised at how many people turn me down because they've written their books, or they under a pseudonym, or they do their podcast and it's audio only, and they do it under a different name because they have a corporate job or a government job that they don't want to risk. Was a common response to, hey, would you like to be interviewed for this? A lot of people did turn it down.
It's less about, or maybe this is also the case, but it sounds like it's perhaps less about the stigma of day-to-day life than it is the very pragmatic decision of perhaps being unemployable for some people.
Precisely.
This is something that you've been doing for decades, and this is a big part of your life, and I assume that it plays a role in probably a lot of the friendships that you have and a lot of the interactions that you have, but that people generally tend to keep these sorts of things siloed in their own lives?
For sure. And honestly, to what you just said, not all of my friends are occultniks by any stretch of the imagination. I have a lot of people that I've never discussed any of this with. My wife and I don't talk about it. She knows how I see the world, but she's far more, more scientific, rational, hard-headed sort of thinker than I am. But she, like I say, we don't discuss it. But she certainly understands how I view things.
Was that a source of conflict early on?
Not at all. Oh, not at all. She knew coming in the door who I was.
She knew she was getting herself into, so to speak.
She did it anyways.
I understand this to a certain extent. I mean, I would say that I'm a pretty skeptical person about lots of different things. Perhaps a lot of people who are scientifically minded don't necessarily afford themselves that, or, you know, or I suppose won't necessarily enter that world with an open mind.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's true. I mean, I would say that the vast majority, of the people that I interviewed did have a fairly rational, not fairly rational, but I would say extremely rational. They don't come off as kooks in any way. And I think that even someone who is extremely rationally minded would not look at these people and say, oh, you know, they believe anything, or, you know, they seem kooky or something. You wouldn't think that about these people at all. You would think that they seem reasonable, and you might want to find out more about why they believe that, what they believe. How
do you keep an open mind for that side of things?
Well, I mean, okay. I've tried to hone this message over the course of the past few weeks, and I've been doing a lot of podcasts, and this is where I've gotten to it with, right? The way that I look at magic is very, I think, scientific in a sense, but at the very least, it's secular for the most part, and I'll get to the exception to that. And that is that if you look at something like Napoleon Hill's books, like Think and Grow Rich, or indeed a lot of these sort of self-help books that, you know, go back to the
business.
Yeah, that's what I was getting to. But I was going to say, like, New Thought, and how New Thought then becomes these business books. There's almost no, certain business books are basically grimoires that have been sort of updated for the 20th and 21st centuries. I mean, a lot of these books are almost, they're the same thing. They're talking about literally the same techniques, which in some cases in magic and also in these business self-help books is a sort of a self-hypnosis, right?
I like self-helpnosis. I don't know if you just coined that, but that actually is quite accurate.
It works, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It works. But self-hypnosis is a big part of magic. It's trying to psych yourself up for something, make something happen that you would like to see happen.
Visualization.
Well, I wasn't even going to take it that far. I mean, that's one way that you could do it, but I would say that you just have to have a clear-cut desire and know what you want, and then understand how to get that. That's not necessarily something that, I mean, that's magic, but it's also a lot of other things too. It depends on how you look at it and the way that you're orienting yourself towards the world that you live in. And I see magic as being a metaphor for creativity. And so if you look at any activity that you are doing as a kind of a spell, or a spell casting, or something that you are doing because you would like to create an influence in the world, even if it's just to make something better for yourself or to make money or whatever it is. But if you start to think of things in that way, your creativity is greatly enhanced.
Manifestation, is that maybe a good way of putting it?
Well, see, that's the thing, is you're taking it more into the New Age sort of thought that I do personally, okay? But so all of that, right? So all of that. So that's push that to one side. The other side of the way that I think about this stuff is that when you start doing magic and when you start to become open to the idea of it, and if you go far enough into it, shall we say, you start to make contact with something or someone or some kind of entity or something that can influence things around you that causes synchronicities and coincidences to happen. Sometimes extremely mathematically improbable coincidences to happen. And that is something that is taught, like that's I would say that that's the biggest and most important part of the Crowley system in many ways, is try to get in touch with this thing, this entity, this thought form, whatever it is, this jinn that will cause synchronicities to happen. Because what you are doing in magic is you're trying to make the less likely more likely. That's something that Dr. Christina Oakley Harrington says in Magick Show. You want to make the less likely more likely. So that's as good of a definition of magic as I've ever heard. But once you tap into this, I don't know what to call it. You know, some people call it the holy guardian angel, right? And then because it sounds so ridiculous.
This sounds like where you're sort of crossing over that line from agnosticism.
Well, that's what I'm trying to say. But the thing is that when you already, if you had these kind of experiences, you get to a point where you have to make a decision like, okay, am I going schizophrenic? Or did this really happen? And you have to, that's where you have to sort of, your rationality has to come into this. And this phenomenon, if you will, of what I'm describing is something that if you put, I mean, you could put people into a room and they would be able to talk to each other about this, and each one of them would know that they know what the fuck they're talking about. And there would be a conversation unlike any other, I can assure you. But this is becoming a common experience, and there are techniques that have been written down since the 14th century of how to connect to that mind, that overmind, or the oversoul, or whatever you want to talk to. You know, Carl Jung has written about this. I mean, there are people, rational, brilliant people, you know, who have talked about this kind of thing. And this has become something that I think a lot of people know about, the synchronicity thing. And because of, you know, the internet and people being able to exchange information more than they could 25 years ago, 30 years ago, it's more people know about this, you know, and so, yeah, so that's yes.
I was looking into this recently, and I will get into why in a second. But I noticed that Jung I think he wrote a book called Synchronicities or Synchronicity. What's your sense of how he approached the subject?
Well, I mean, he's the guy who coined the term, I think, if I'm not mistaken. I mean, so, you know, he observed certain things that seemed to him to be very significant and to be, you know, the way that they were connected caused significance. But, you know, and he's looking at it also from a point of view of self-actualization and you know, and dealing with patients also. So, you know, are these messages from the subconscious mind? Are they from some sort of oversoul? I mean, he had sort of, you know, shall we say, idiosyncratic religious beliefs that involved his own person in sort of prophecies and stuff like that. I mean, these things are not widely known, but he was the person who sort of noticed these kind of things and sort of codified this idea, or one of the first to put this in writing and put this idea out into the world. It's been refined since then by other people.
The way you phrased it is very interesting, as whether or not it was messages from the subconscious mind, because you know, to a certain extent, the power of these things are their externality from us. That these are things that we're encountering outside of us.
Well, that's the thing. You have to decide, again, am I having a schizophrenic reaction to something, the stimuli, or is this really actually happening? And the thing that I noticed when I started to have a lot of these things happening to me when I was at the age of 29 was that it took the form of someone like literally like fucking with my head, like joking with me, like trying to get me to notice what is going on now in an unmistakable way that I could. Let me just back up for a second. This happened to me when I was 29 because I was taking a lot of psychedelic drugs, right? I would have described myself as it was at one of the lowest points of my entire life, and I felt that I needed to do something to just detonate the logjam that was my career and my life at that point. Things were not going well for me. And so I thought if I did something like that, and by the way, I'd also, simultaneous to this, I've been picking up a lot of occult books, whereas that was something that I was doing throughout my teens and early 20s, but in my mid to later 20s, I was less focused on, but had started again to pick up a lot of occult books. And one of the things that I was reading for the first time was Robert Anton Wilson's The Cosmic Trigger. And I read that for the first time when I was about that age, so 29. So that book is kind of a guidebook from a very friendly perspective of somebody who was going through more or less the same thing that was happening to me. And it was like a perfect book to have been reading at the time that this was happening. But also I was doing the drugs as well, or taking the psilocybin and DMT that I was smoking because of that book also. So it was all intertwined. But the point is that that's when it started happening for me. I started to notice a lot of really, really like unusual things that had happened. And I would start to think like, okay, am I going nuts? Or is this really going on? And so there has to be sort of a way to test that, okay? To literally test your rationality when you're doubting it, right? And so in my case, a lot of things happened in a short period of time that were objectively true. And I could give you an example of this. Is I was in a bookstore once, and I was trying to figure out, like, I was really broke, right? And I was like, should I buy this book and just eat rice and beans until Thursday or not, you know? And so I said, I'm going to just open this book, and I'm going to put my finger on any page and any point, and the word or the phrase that is underneath my finger, if this is significant to me, then I will buy this book. Well, guess what? My last name was under my finger. My last name was under my finger. And then I thought, well, that was interesting. Let me do it a second time and see if there's a part two of this message that it will be unmistakably significant to me. And so I did it again. I opened the book, I put my finger down, and guess what my finger was on? My date of birth. Okay? In the same book. I'm not kidding. And the thing is, I can actually show you this because I guess we're doing an audio-only thing, but this book that I'm holding up in front of the camera right now that your listeners cannot hear is that book. And I could, flip through this. No, I won't, but I could flip through this and show you exactly my last name.
Can you describe what the book is?
This book is a book called Nuit Isis, and it is you would say it's like a compilation of like papers and articles that are related to Aleister Crowley. Nuit Isis, right? But the thing, like I say, and so that happened, right? So I don't have to wonder, is that just me? Because I can pick this up 30 years later, 28 years later, and show this to you right now. You see what I'm saying?
Is that the same copy?
This is it.
That's
the
book.
book. Correct. The one that you're looking at right now. So if something like that happens to you, I think that you would be justified in saying, okay, this is outside of me. But that's not the only example I could give you. I could give you dozens and dozens of examples just like that. And I'm talking about my name and my birthday in a book. This has happened. You know what I mean? I could just start showing you the evidence of this. And the other thing is, a lot of these experiences that I've had have additionally had a witness, or there was another person that was involved in this who was also noticing it, or who indeed had pointed it out to me in the first place. So there was a whole spate of these things that were happening. But my experience is not that unique. Many people were telling me similar things that had happened to them on camera and for the Magick Show interviews. So what I'm trying to get across to your listeners is that this is not an uncommon thing. This is something that a lot of people have had experience with. They've gone through that same sort of process of, am I going crazy, or is this some kind of is this really happening in reality? And that is what they call, in occult terms, crossing the abyss. You're having an experience that you're either going to go bonkers because you're going to try to chase all of this kind of stuff, and you're going to find significance in numbers constantly and stuff like that. Every time you look at the clock, it's a certain number.
It does cross over into paranoid schizophrenia at some point.
Well, that's the thing. It can, but if it doesn't, then you have crossed the abyss in occult terms. So that's what that means. And even if you're just looking at it as a process of psychology, it's a significant one.
Something I like to talk to creative people about, musicians especially, is the idea of the muse, right? And channeling that creativity from somewhere else. I think that when it's working well, it can be a very helpful thing. But those times when it's not, it can be incredibly frustrating. You don't know what to do with yourself. You don't know how to get back to that point. What does it mean when you don't experience those things? Does it mean that you're not open in the right way? Does it mean that you're on the wrong track?
Well, I don't know what it means, because that's above my pay grade, certainly. But I did hear a metaphor the other day that was so absolutely perfect that I repeat it as often as I can now when I'm talking about this subject. But I was on a podcast called "This Podcast is a Ritual," and the very intelligent, very brilliant host of this show is a guy named Devin Person, and we were talking about this, and he said, and I was explaining something that had happened to me in detail, similar to the story I just was telling you, and he said, and I said, but it never adds up to anything. That's the thing, is it's not like there's this one coherent message where you can say, oh, that and that happened, and that must be this message for me. Because it's never, in my experience, it's never been that way.
You didn't pick up the Crowley book and your life just turned around magically.
No, the thing was, I look at it this way, it was where my attention was at that moment. And so, but here's the other thing to think about. Okay, for me to have had that experience, right? That book had to have been printed up and written and published, and you know what I'm saying? Years before this, and then it was published in the UK in a small edition by an independent, an entity. But yet it made it to the shop in New York, and there I was in front of it asking it this question. I didn't have to ask it that question. I didn't have to pick it up off the shelf, but I did. And so it did happen. And the thing that I think is interesting about that also is you say, well, what are the odds of that having happened? The answer is 100% because it did happen. It did happen. You see what I'm saying? So that's kind of, did I answer your question? I'm not sure I did.
In order to have had that specific experience.
Oh, I know. Oh, hang on. I remember what I was going to say, right? It's what Devin told me, right? And he said, and this is, like I say, it's perfect. But listen to this. He said, so think of it this way. If you're sort of walking on a path through your life, and you're looking at, and there's flowers and beautiful things and bunny rabbits jumping around this path, and everything is like fantastic and great. That's what the synchronicities are when they happen. It's just that. You can't really look at it any more than that. But if you're your path suddenly takes a turn to like broken glass and beer bottles and syringes and used condoms, you're on it's a different trajectory that you're on. And I thought, well, that's really a good way of putting it. I have never found that a lack of, shall we say, of synchronicities happening to me for years and years at a time is anything to be alarmed at. You know what I mean? I, for the most part, have worked from home for the past 25 years of my life. So it's not like I'm out in the world and things are happening to me in that way. But when I am out in the world and when I am doing something which I consider to be spellcasting, and which somebody else might look at as documentary filmmaking, of course. But when I see that happen, that's when these things start to happen again. And I've lately been going through, as I've been doing this, Kickstarter and doing a lot of podcasts and talking about these things, have literally been synchronicities that have happened while the shows are being recorded. There are people showing up from my past it's a very interesting thing what's going on right now, and so the past month has been a period of intense synchronicity, just off the charts. Whereas many times, years and years will go by, and I wouldn't perceive anything as necessarily that, and it does not alarm me. It does not alarm me in any way.
You discussed almost like the butterfly effect, all these things that had to fall in line perfectly in order for that book to arrive on the shelf in front of you. But
yeah.
But also, I think what you were alluding to as well, though, is that you had to ask that question and you had to be open to receive that information.
Well, yes, that's true. But it would have existed no matter what my orientation was towards that.
But in terms of actually receiving that specific information and then purchasing the book, you had to ask that question.
Well, yeah. I also had to be in that store that day. It also had to be a situation where that book hadn't been purchased the day before by someone else, which it could have been in a different reality. So it lined up for me. If you run the film backwards, a lot of things had to happen for that experience of significance to occur to me.
To complete that transaction, you had to be open to that transaction completing, and you had to believe that that was significant information.
Well, who wouldn't have faced with that?
But most people, or a lot of people, wouldn't have asked the book the question in the first place, and they wouldn't have put their finger down.
Well, like I say, I was going through a period of intense synchronicities anyway, so I was more inclined to, go through such a thought experiment as to do that.
In order for these synchronicities to, again, probably above your pay grade, but in order for these synchronicities to really be significant, do you have to be open and do you have to believe that they're significant?
Well, it didn't happen to you, so let me ask you, what would you say? I just told you a story that happened to me, so how do you react to that? I know how I react to it. But I don't feel like it's a subjective reaction. It seems I'm objecting. I'm reacting to something that exists in objective reality. So how do you react to my story? I mean, the thing is, I didn't just tell you that story because it seems like a lie almost because it's so stupid, right? Wouldn't you say? I think it's dumb, but anyway, but I'm not embarrassed to tell you the story because again, I just held the book up and showed it to you on camera. So how do you react to that story? Is what I want to know.
Let me give you a story that I experienced recently. And that it's not quite of that level, but it's significant enough that it really stopped me in my tracks. And that you're the second person who I'm telling this to after my therapist, because I really want to get your take on this and how to react to it.
I'm honored.
Because I've been thinking about synchronicity specifically because of this, and it's very interesting that I think we met years ago, but that you've kind of come back into my life as I'm trying to, process this information. So I recently left New York City after 20 years. I moved upstate into the Hudson Valley. I bought this house. So, things have been changing in my life. I think, largely for the better. About 2 or 3 weeks ago, I'm sorry, I'm going to bring the podcast down a little bit, but about 2 or 3 weeks ago, my cousin and her 13-year-old son were died in a car crash. Three other children, a mother. Horrible, right? I mean, just beyond the kind of stuff that makes you, But about a week later, I walk outside and there's a piece of paper just sitting like trash, but not trash with other trash, like just a stray piece of litter. I look down, it's a personal check, and the name on the check was my cousin's first name and her son's first name. Those were the first and last name of the person on the check. That to me, right, again, probability very low of something like that happening.
Very low, yeah.
What does one do when these sorts of things enter their lives?
I don't know. I mean, I just don't have an answer for you. I don't think anybody really does. I think, like I was saying, Devin Person's definition of that path with the flowers seems to be, it's the best one I've heard.
Just to sort of accept that the universe is telling you something or that you're on the right path, that you're with the bunnies in the sunshine?
Well, I mean, I don't see, it would be difficult to say that about the experience that you just described, obviously. So, I just don't know. I know that these things happen and that other people notice that they happen too. You're noticing that it happens, but the explanation of it has always escaped me. I've never seen any. It doesn't add up to anything. It never has for me.
Those of us who spend their lives pursuing information, we're building on the information collected by people in the past. You picked up the Crowley book, or we were talking about Jung, or any other numbers of people. There's always an acceptance that any rational person in their life, that certain things are going to remain a mystery for the rest of your life, that you're probably never going to quite figure out what to do with that information, if only because of, for the hundreds of years or thousands of years that people have been seeking out that piece of information, they haven't stumbled upon it either.
Exactly.
Cliche to say it's a journey, not the destination, but just sort of broadly speaking, what is the value in trying to pursue this information and having these conversations on this specific topic?
I feel that I can offer something to people who are looking to find answers, or at least some solace in knowing that they're not alone in this way. But I also think that I have always tried. If you ask me, like, okay, what were you put on this planet to do? What's your goal in life? It's been to encourage people to become more intelligent. It's been to encourage people to be skeptical and to understand the media that they get is not necessarily something that is unbiased. But I feel like within the occult space, certain things have happened to me that I am able to explain. I think in a way that people might see something happening similar to them, and be able to learn from that. I feel like also by bringing these other people who have participated in Magick Show with me, hopefully, in a professionally produced sort of production like this, it will reach a wide audience.
It's palatable.
Yeah, it's palatable. That's the thing is, I don't think, as the editor and cameraman Eric Middleman, who's one of my oldest friends, by the way, the guy that I'm working with is somebody who's been like a brother to me for most of my life. He says this. He said it many times. And he's like, no one would start watching this and turn it off. Like no one, and I think that's true.
That's about as high as praise gets these days. That somebody's attention span can last for that entire interview.
Yeah, exactly. Don't we know it? But it's like, with the TikTok attention span. But I mean, I think that people would just sort of, I don't think he's wrong. I think no one would turn this off because it's very compelling, and the personalities are very strong personalities. So it's very compelling. And again, they're looking straight at the camera. So you're making eye contact with them, and that's part of, I think, why that is so powerful. We're making eye contact right now in that way, so.
You explain this synchronicity, and I've heard you, I listened to some recent interviews that you did as well, where you describe some others, and they're about of that caliber as far as improbability.
Yeah.
You alluded a little bit to some things that had happened over the years. I know we discussed the synchronicities. I'm sure that those played a role in it as well. But as somebody who is, who is scientifically minded and who values skepticism, which it sounds like you do, this is something you, again, having listened to some recent interviews you did, this is something that you've been interested in from a fairly young age.
Yeah.
What has kept you in and around that world, and what has kept you pursuing that subject?
Oh, it's a worldview. It's a worldview. It's always you're sort of alluding to when I was younger. I guess when I was talking about on some of these other podcasts, there was never a time in my life that I can remember that I did not sort of consider myself to be someone who does or could do magic. And that was everything from relating to the Elizabeth Montgomery's family on Bewitched.
Bewitched, yeah.
You know what I mean? Like like her Uncle Arthur, the warlock. I mean, that just seemed like a cool thing to me. And I was also really into.
Sorry, it's gonna drive me crazy until I think of the actor's name, the comedian who played Uncle Arthur.
It wasn't Maurice Evans, was it? It's he's the guy with the mustache.
Paul Lynde.
Was it?
Paul Lynde, right? Wasn't Paul Lynde Uncle?
Well, there were three. I can remember. I don't remember him in that, to tell you the truth. But he probably was. But it's been like 50 years probably since I've watched an episode of Bewitched.
That trivia just crawls into your brain, and you until you get that piece of it. I'm pretty sure it was Paul Lynde was Uncle Arthur, but I could also be wrong.
I bet you're right, though. So, but that was the kind of character that I would look at and sort of identify with in a strange way. Bell, Book, and Candle was another film that I really loved when I was a kid. And but that, like I say, it's sort of, I instinctively knew, shall we say, or felt that I was one of them.
Since I mentioned Paul Lynde, kind of interesting that there's almost a parallel to sexuality there, as far as knowing, what is the Bob Dylan, something's happening here, but you don't know what it is. There's something, there's something maybe a little bit different, and maybe different from your friends and your family. But until you have that vocabulary and until you see examples of it, you don't quite know what's different about you.
Well, that's kind of fantastic that you use Paul Lynde as the example, because he's such a unique person in pop culture of the 60s and 70s and 80s because he was one of the very first, clearly, obviously, visibly gay men, but it was never discussed. It was never discussed. You knew that there was something perhaps different about Paul Lynde, but it wasn't discussed. It was never, I think think about Elton John's sexuality was barely hinted at until he himself decided to come out as a bisexual.
Liberace, very famously.
Exactly, yeah, exactly. Liberace too. It's like no one really talked about it. It was kind of understood, but the thought never got connected, shall we say. It was like it was just sort of hanging out in space. The thought never got connected with the general public. And that brings up something else that I saw that was fascinating recently, is that there's a documentary that was made by Mike Wallace. It was pre-60
Of 60 Minutes, yeah.
Yeah, but it was just a couple of years before that. I think it came out in 1968, and it was called The Homosexual. But I mean, how crazy is that? If you think about it, it's like within the last, 55 years, there had to be a documentary explaining the concept of homosexuality on network television to explain that to the American people.
I don't want to belittle anyone's struggles on either side, but do you think that there is a parallel as far as people's understanding and acceptance of the occult?
Not really. Not really. I think that a lot that maybe would have been the case before. Like, let's certainly say, like the satanic panic era of the late '80s. I think it certainly wasn't be the kind of thing that you would want to put. Had Facebook existed then, it wouldn't have been the kind of thing you would want to have advertised about yourself at that time, because it could have affected your employment. But here today, in a post-Harry Potter, post-MCU universe, I think that, it's very common. I mean, witchcraft is something that has been picked up as it's a subset of feminism to a certain extent. So for someone to call themselves a witch could be seen in those terms as well. But it's a very common thing for people to identify with these days, and so I don't think there's a whole lot of stigma attached to it, as like there used to be.
Harry Potter, obviously problematic for different reasons relating to sexuality now, but right. As far as whether it's Harry Potter, obviously Bewitched. There's always been an element, even King Arthur, right? There's always been magic in popular culture, but not everyone makes that leap necessarily from this is a fictionalized. No one this is playing a statement, but I would assume the majority of people who watch Marvel movies don't think that they're real. But do you feel that just like a representation of that in popular culture is perhaps opening up people's minds to possibilities?
I do, and specifically when we talk about the MCU, when people in that audience, and that's millions and millions and millions of people around the world, they're hearing about something like chaos magic. And it sounds cool, and they think they know what it is, but do they know that it's something that started in the 70s or arguably before that with Austin Spare? But do they know that it was a real thing, a movement within the occult community that took place historically in the 1970s and in the 1980s and beyond, and that it is in fact, I would say undoubtedly the most commonly practiced form of magic. I would think. That's my guess, I guess. But did these people who are watching those movies know that? In
a sense, I think maybe obviously the internet broadly, but there's a good argument to be made that Wikipedia is the most empowering entity in the history of mankind as far as opening people up to different channels of knowledge.
Absolutely. I would agree with that.
I guess in that specific case, it's that pursuit of hearing about something in a movie, researching. I hate to say doing your own research, because that has its own baggage in the
certain connotations. Yeah,
but it is that opportunity to sort of like take that next step into the broader world. And pre-Wikipedia, just even going to the library and researching some books on the subject. Sorry, I bring up QAnon, but that's an interesting example of some of this almost in reverse, where it's people making connections in their mind and taking them in a far more problematic direction.
Yeah. I mean, QAnon to me is a phenomenon that was clearly amplified by the Russians. And if you really look at the way that knowledge, that information, how widely distributed it became, there's a certain point where you can sort of look at look at the internet and just say, like, okay, how many mentions of this were there? And then on a certain day it explodes. Okay, and there was no doubt about it that it was the Russians who were amplifying that signal. And that kind of information war, to me, I would describe that as black magic, because it's a way of literally just doing harm to your enemies from a distance. That's the definition of black magic, and you're doing that the Russians are doing that in such a way that they're taking something that's so malign, right? This whole QAnon, the father and I can't think of their names, but the father and son who operate that server where it was, and they have all of these, it's been rumored.
8chan.
Yeah, exactly, and it's been rumored that they have even child pornography and stuff like that on their servers, and they're very unsavory characters. And Vice has done documentaries on them, and you can see what they look like and where they live and the whole thing. And the evidence is pretty compelling that it's these two weirdos, who are the ones who are propagating this. There are millions and millions of people whose minds have been hijacked by this sort of thought contagion, if you will, and then the Russians have amplified it even further, so it just keeps going. So the Russians have taken something it's like saying, oh, here's this kind of information cancer, let's just, do what we can to make it spread as far as we can. And that's, like I say, that is a kind of a black magic. They're destroying American families that can't speak to each other anymore because there's a QAnon adherent. There are people who are ruining their own lives over this. Or they talk about it in absurd ways. It's a strange phenomenon to observe all of this. But like I say, it's a kind of a black magic is the way that I see that.
Maybe I'm giving people too much benefit of the doubt, broadly speaking, but I think there are parallels to be drawn with these, I guess sort of seeking knowledge, and in the case of what's been happening, I would say late stage capitalism, early 20th century, and an empire in decline that we're all dealing with. Everyone understands broadly in the U.S. that things are bad and that things are not going in the right direction. The difference is what certain people, what the sources are. I think in the same way that you have, and a lot of people have pursued this, they're seeking these answers in QAnon, and historically that people have looked into religion for these kinds of answers. There's a lot of parallels to be drawn, but again, and this is getting very abstract and very subjective, I guess, but how do you know when you're on the right path? How do you know that you're working for the forces of good and not evil?
Well, I mean, in terms of understanding what the difference between QAnon and rational worldview.
When you start the journey down the rabbit hole, when you start the journey of quote doing your own research.
Well, it's people who are just not media literate. It's as simple as that. I mean, it's just something that the American school system just has not kept up the pace on. I mean, it's interesting. I read it. I don't remember where exactly I read this, but apparently the younger people it's much easier for them to recognize shit from Shinola now. They sort of understand something that's more, as it were, fake news or propaganda than that older people do, because they've been exposed to it all their lives. So they have a more sensitive or nuanced view of it than somebody who was. And that was the thing that I was noticing, and I thought I sort of predicted what happened in the 90s. That was when you had better art direction of websites, and they were running banner ads for things, that advertising would confer a patina of this must be the truth, or like if something that if in other words, like if corporate America would be sponsoring something like this, it must have passed a certain muster. So so something like Breitbart would have been one of the first sites that sort of really benefited from, like I say, a more professional presentation from the graphic design point of view, and also from the use of advertising, which is a semiotic message that is a strong one to someone who doesn't know any better and can't, and who cannot really I mean, that's the thing is, I think largely you look at the American public, a lot of people just believe the last thing that they read. They don't have any deeply held beliefs at all.
That's the whole Trump thing you hear about, right? That he literally the last person who spoke to him.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, he is the avatar of that sort of mindset in the population. I would say that there's probably about 25, between 25 and 30% of the population in this country is just a bunch of fucking idiots.
One of the conversations that I listened to ahead of this was you spoke to a month or so ago. It was posted. You spoke to our mutual friend Douglas Rushkoff, and the subject of Gamergate came up, and that and Pepe and that whole phenomenon is perhaps an example, kind of counter to, I don't know whether it's media literacy, but certainly the kind of broadly held idea that people are more liberal as they're younger. I would say I've gone counter. I've actually moved further left as I've gotten older, but that's a different conversation. But when you look at that on one side, and then when you look on media literacy on the other side, just broadly in terms of what's happening in the world and how bad everything kind of feels to everyone right now, what are the things that give you hope that it's going to turn around and that we will head in that right direction at some point?
Yeah. Report the world's longest sigh. I don't know. I'm a generally pretty optimistic person, and I would certainly consider myself a utopian. I too, I would say I'm probably on the political scale as left as you can get in many respects. And so I think, one of the things that actually does give me hope is AI. And I think because AI is going to disrupt the job market to the extent that it's going to require that there is some kind of guaranteed income situation that happens. And I think that that's going to be a big step towards a future where people are not as, the thing is, if the state is going to have to provide for people when they can no longer provide for themselves,
But what you're describing, I get the sense of, and this is speaking as somebody who, I'm a writer and I write about technology, so I think about that specifically a lot. But you're almost describing, the idea of kind of hitting a rock bottom where things have to get so bad that things can start to get better again. In that case, a lot of people will have to lose their jobs.
Well, I'm not seeing it as a rock bottom situation. I'm saying that the trends, when situation like a job like an accountant is no longer necessary as a job category, and you have tens of millions of people who will never be employed in that field again, and they've been doing it their entire lives. It's truckers also. When there's automated vehicles that are going to be moving our food and goods across state lines, and there's no longer a need for long-haul trucking, or even arguably even shorter delivery hauls. That's the biggest job category in the United States, and every single city and county in this country is being a trucker, delivering things, and that's going to go away. There's just no question that this is going to happen, but I don't see it as being a situation where everybody's lost their job and they hit rock bottom. I'm saying there has to be a transition out of this, and it's going to happen quickly because people are going to need to eat, and everybody's going to recognize this collectively. You know what I mean? I don't care if you look on the right or the left. You know what I mean? When you have no food for your family and you have no possibility of getting a job, and this has been going on for months and months and months, there's going to be a political upheaval in this country that I predict will go into a positive direction because people are going to want things to be better for them, and they'll decide something rationally as opposed to something that is that's more fear-based or religious. You know what I mean? Like this is a real thing that is going to sharpen people's minds in the near future about the direction that this country is going to go in. We're at an inflection point right now. You know what I mean? It could go either way. It could go towards fascism, or it could go towards utopianism. I have a feeling that it's going to go in the direction that I'm hoping for, that it will a more just and more economically secure future for the people in this country and around the world. Because I think AI is going to make that happen. It's going to increase productivity will be increased, but the need for people to actually do things will be decreased by such a degree. You just can't expect people to just lay down on the road and die. It's just not going to happen. It's not feasible. They're going to have to do something. The whole concept of money is going to have to, in exchange, will have to be rethought and reconfigured around something that's workable in a scenario where some people are incapable by the structure of the super system in being able to participate in it.